Today we are talking about ecosystems. This is a brand new unit, so you can go ahead, turn a new page in your notebook, and you're going to put this title at the top, ecosystems. Hopefully this should be a little bit of review because I know you guys learned some of this stuff about food webs and food chains in 7th grade. Maybe you've forgotten a little bit of it, but it should be a little bit of a review. There might be some new stuff in here, but that's okay. So ecosystems is the title of this unit. All right. So this is what we're going to be talking about kind of for the rest of the year is environment, ecosystems, animals, plants, how they interact together. So we already wrote this in my class. We wrote this when we talked about natural selection. So we're going to go ahead and skip writing this down, okay? So species is a group of individuals that look alike and can interbreed or reproduce together. So you guys already talked about this a little bit in the evolution unit. So we define a species as a group of individuals that look alike and can interbreed and reproduce. Again, you don't need to write this down because you should have this in your notebook from the evolution unit. You also do not need to write this down because we already talked about what a population is. We said a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area. So for example, we could have a group of polar bears living in a certain part of the Arctic. Or we could say a group of squirrels living in a forest is a population. Now, a population is kind of subjective, meaning you can kind of define what area you want to say includes that population. So, for example, we could say all the squirrels in my backyard, that would be a population. Or we could say all the squirrels in Kenosha or all the squirrels in Wisconsin. So you can kind of play around, and scientists are able to identify different population sizes based on the area that they're looking at. All right, so here's where we're going to start writing down. So go ahead, write this down. A community. All right, you might think of Kenosha as a community or Tremper as a community. A community has populations of different species that all live in the same area. Now, I wrote here potentially interacting. So they might interact, they might not directly interact. A lot of times we don't see these interactions happening. So even though we might not think that say for example, fox interacts with a plant, well, maybe it is eating berries off of that plant, but we just didn't think about it. So community is populations of different species living in the same area. So if we go back to our polar bears, our group of polar bears was a population. Okay. Now, if we include the other animals in that area, penguins, maybe the plankton in the water, the fish in the water, the elephant seals, maybe there's some moss that grows on the rocks, that would be a community. So we're talking about all of the species in one area. Okay. If we go to, Africa, a community would be the zebra, the lions, the acacia trees, the wildebeest, all of those species living in the same area. So communities exist everywhere, all right? And when we talk about a community, we're just talking about all of the species, all the living things in an area. Now, the next step up from a community is an ecosystem. So we said a community is all of the living things in an area. An ecosystem includes all of the living and non-living things in an area. So this part is key, non-living things, okay? So if we go to our polar bear example, a community would be the polar bear, the penguins, the fish, all of that stuff. An ecosystem would include all the non-living things, the ice, the water, the rocks, the sun, the soil. All of those non-living things make up the ecosystem. So when we include all the animals plus their environment, all the things that are not living, then we get an ecosystem. And that's what this whole unit is about. This whole unit is about ecosystems, or basically environments with organisms in them. And we know that organisms can't survive without these non-living things. We couldn't survive without water, or land, or sunshine, because those plants that we depend on require sunshine. So an ecosystem is a system of all living and non-living things. Now, an ecosystem, like we said, has living and non-living things. Okay, we call these biotic and abiotic factors. What does bio mean? Anyone remember what the prefix bio means? Bio means living or life, right? Or alive. So biotic factors are living things. Abiotic means not living. Think about all the other words you know that start with A, all right? Asymmetrical means not symmetrical, right? Um, a lot of people give me asexual, okay? Not sexual reproduction, all right? So A in front of a word means not, right? So biotic factors, living things, and abiotic factors, non-living things, all right? So let's write those definitions really quick. Now, biotic, this is really important. They're living things or once living things, things that come from living things, okay? So if it was once part of a living thing, it is a biotic factor. So something like a bone. A bone is not alive, but it came from a living thing. So it would be biotic. A dead person would be biotic. Why? Because it was once alive. Okay, so living or once living things. A leaf that's on the ground or a dead plant, that would be biotic. Why? Because it was once alive. Then we have abiotic factors, which are things that have never lived. Dirt, rocks, sun, okay? Anything you can think of that has never actually lived before, okay? So these are the two types of things that we can find in an ecosystem. And remember, an ecosystem has to have both of these things for it to be an ecosystem. Otherwise, if it just has living things, it's only a community. Okay, so what I'm going to have you guys do right now is we're going to do a Venn diagram. So there's going to be some words that I'm going to pass, or words that are going to be on the top of a Venn diagram, and you're going to have to categorize them into living and non-living, or biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, now if you remember, a Venn diagram has a middle section. So what would be in this middle section? Things that have both abiotic and biotic factors, right? And what did we say has both biotic and abiotic factors? An ecosystem. So any kind of ecosystem, for example, a jungle might be an ecosystem, a forest might be an ecosystem, that would have biotic and abiotic factors. So you're going to go ahead and see if you can sort these into biotic and abiotic factors, and then we'll come back together and go over them. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to go over the biotic and abiotic factors. All right, and now we're going to talk about food webs. So this should look super familiar. I think that you guys did these before. You should have done them in elementary school and in middle school. So a food web, why do we make them? Okay, you might say, oh, it's so we can see what eats something else. Well, really, what we're doing is we're looking at how energy is transferred from organism to organism. So when, for example, the robin eats the earthworm, okay, the robin's getting energy from the earthworm. That's why it has to eat. That's why you guys have to eat in order to get energy. All right. So food webs show how the energy is transferred from one organism to another. Now let's take a look at these arrows on this food web. What do you notice about the arrows? What direction do they always point? They're always pointing up. Now, arrows don't need to always point up in a food web, because you could draw this sideways and it would be totally okay. But the key here is that the organism, or that the arrows always point to the organism that's eating, that's getting the energy. So in this example, the robin's getting the energy from the earthworm, right? So if it were the other way around, right? When a robin ate the earthworm's not getting energy, the earthworm's dead, right? He's getting eaten. The robin's getting the energy. So food webs show how energy is transferred from one organism to another. So all energy, where does this energy come from then if we're transferring energy in a food web? The energy comes from the sun, okay? Now, I put in parentheses here, or chemicals. So we know that plants can do photosynthesis, right? So they can get energy from the sun. They don't have to eat other things. That's why plants don't have mouths, all right? But what about, organisms down in the bottom of the ocean? How do they get their energy? Because they don't have sunlight. The ocean is miles deep, right? Sunlight can't get all the way down there. So what happens to them? How do they get their energy? Well, some of them at the bottom of these deep hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean can actually use chemicals. So there's bacteria, ancient bacteria that lives down there. We said that's archaea, right? And they can actually use chemicals and make food from the chemicals or the compounds that are in the water. Okay? So we call any organism that can do this an autotroph or a producer. Why? Because it produces its own food. So autotrophs should be reviewed. You guys should have learned about autotrophs in the beginning of the year. Okay. Well, in food webs, we call these guys producers. They mean the same thing. Okay. What does auto mean? Auto means self, right? And then troph means feeding. So this is self-feeding. It's able to feed itself on its own food that it makes. It doesn't have to rely on other organisms, right? So these are the things that make up the bottom of our food web, okay? And other organisms rely on them for food. So an autotroph or a producer is an organism that can make its own food from the sun or from energy, okay? Now, a heterotroph or a consumer is an organism that has to get energy by eating other organisms. So we are heterotrophs, or we are consumers. Why? Because we can't go lay out in the sun and make our own food just from laying in the sun like plants can do. We have to eat other things. So we have to eat plants, we have to eat meat from animals. So in this diagram right here, right, we have two consumers, right? The zebra has to eat grass in order to survive. The lion has to eat zebra. They both have to eat other things. The plant doesn't eat anything, right? It's a producer. It just needs the sun in order to survive, all right? So heterotrophs, consumers, need to eat things in order to get energy, all right? Now, we have different types of consumers. So we're going to talk about the different types of consumers next.